Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for today's video, I'm bringing you guys episode 3 of my Stephen King ranking novella series. I will put down links for episode 1 and 2 in the series. Episode 1, I'm basically talking about my least favorite Stephen King novellas. And then in episode 2, I'm talking about the meh novellas. They're not bad, but they're kind of meh. For episode 3, for today's episode, it's going to be titled the Eventual episode. And what I mean by that is that all 3 of the novellas that I'm talking about today are in the collection Everything's Eventual. And when I was coming up with my master list for my ranking for all of these novellas, it was definitely coincidental that the 3 novellas in this episode, which is kind of like the middle portion of the first tier for this ranking list, they all happen to be in this one collection. So this episode will be the Eventual episode. And when I initially came up with the idea for ranking all of his novellas, I assumed that a lot of the novellas in here would be a little higher on the list. So when I initially made my list, all 3 of the novellas that I'm going to talk about today were higher. But after episode 1, I quickly realized that in order to do this ranking properly, I'm going to have to go back and reread a lot of them, especially the ones that I don't necessarily remember or the ones that I just want to double check to see if they're actually, some of my favorites or not. And so when I initially came up with the list, the 3 novellas that I'm going to talk about today were definitely, they weren't like all-time favorites, so they weren't like in my top 10 or anything, but they were definitely higher than they are now at 26, 25, and 24. But when I went back and reread them, I quickly realized that I had to make some changes, and that some of the novellas that I originally had lower on the list that I gone back and reread, I'm going to have to put a little bit higher. So I definitely was surprised. And again, none of these are bad. They're just not quite as good as I remember them being. I thought they were like really good. But, with a reread, upon a reread, they weren't quite as good as the first time. They're definitely better than the previous ones. Like episode 2 was all about the meh novellas. These are better than meh. They're pretty good. I do have some slight issues with all of them, and I'll get to them right now. Shit. All right, so for number 26 on my list, I'm going to have 1408. 1408 is probably the most surprising for me, having gone back and reread it. I always thought that it was, from my first experience reading it, I thought it was very good. So when I reread it like a few weeks back, I was assuming that I would still love it as much. But the second time through, kind of knowing already what the story is, it wasn't as compelling. For anyone who doesn't know what the story is about, it's basically about a guy who got famous for writing books about paranormal sightings or paranormal phenomena. And he's heard about this hotel that has a room 1408, and that a lot of people have like mysteriously passed away, like either in the room or like people who are associated with the hotel, they've passed away from it. And so he's very curious to like spend the night there, when a lot of people are telling him it's probably not a good idea, including like the hotel manager. He's like, you're going to go up there and stuff's going to happen. And the whole thing is like the guy, he's writing all of this paranormal stuff. He doesn't really believe a lot of it. So he's kind of skeptical. And then of course it's Stephen King, so some crazy crap's going to happen. And that stuff is good. It's just, it's not as surprising, or like I said, it's not as compelling the second time through, because you basically already know what's going to happen. And as far as the weird and wacky stuff that kind of happens in the hotel room when he's in there, I actually prefer the adaptation, because you get to like visually see what is happening and like what's going through his mind and like what he's actually seeing. Whereas in the novella, it can sometimes be harder to imagine what exactly he's seeing. So it's kind of a weird thing where like the adaptation is slightly better in my opinion, or at least slightly more enjoyable. But again, it's still a pretty good read. Like I enjoyed my time with it. I just thought that I probably would have ranked it, you know, in somewhere in the teens, like maybe like 17 or 16, but like having it be at 26 was definitely surprising to me. And it just goes to show like how many great Stephen King novellas there are, where like I thought this was going to be really high, but it actually turned out to be relatively low. So a lot of the novellas coming after are going to be just stellar, and it's going to be really hard to rank them. And of course, I'm just now remembering that 1408 is literally on the cover of the book. Like, I could have just showed that. Oh, Jake. Oh, Jake. But anyway, 1408 is number 26. And for number 25 on my list, we're going to go with the title story, Everything's Eventual. This was also definitely one that I originally had higher on my list, but when I went back and reread it, I was, how do I explain it? Probably the best way to explain it is that when I originally read it, years and years ago when I was a lot younger, I guess I could have related more to the main character, because he's sort of like a younger dude in his like early 20s, I think, and he has this weird ability where he can manipulate people by drawing these weird drawings, and this guy kind of hires him to do stuff for him, and he gets to basically live in this house, and he gets paid to just kind of like hang out there and just do whatever he wants. So maybe I would have related to him on that, because it's like, oh, that sounds like a sweet gig. But reading it now, I was kind of a little bored with the character, and to be honest, I didn't, you know, and it's told through first person perspective. I wasn't a huge fan of the main character, like the guy, and I'll be honest, I don't even remember his name, but there were some aspects that I do really like about it. And, you know, for Dark Tower fans, it is connected to the Dark Tower, and I'm sure that a lot of people would love to read it because of that. And also kind of the reveal at the end is really good. Like, that part of the novella is actually really good. And then the very ending, where the character kind of like makes a decision, I really liked that. But overall, again, this just wasn't as good as I remember it being. Like, I remember this being like so good, and then I went back and reread it, and I was like, I mean, I can kind of understand why I liked it in the past, but for me, it's definitely not one of like his all-time best. Also, a few weeks back, I was talking with Leslie from The Nerdy Narrative about how sometimes with Stephen King audiobooks, and especially with like his short story collections, they'll get like really random, like either A-list or B-list celebrities to narrate the short stories or novellas. And for Everything's Eventual, like of all people, they got Justin Long to narrate it. And I'm like, what? Like, who like the director for the audiobook was like, we need to get Justin Long right now. I'm like, what? But anyway, I don't have too much more to say about Everything's Eventual. I'll just say again that it wasn't as good as I thought it was going to be. And I'm super glad that I decided to go back and reread a lot of these novellas. Otherwise, this ranking would have been totally different and probably not as clear and concise as it needed to be. So I'm glad that I decided to go back and reread the ones, at least the ones that I don't remember. There are definitely ones like my top tier ones that I've read several times that I know are my favorites. I will be rereading those still just because they're awesome, but like I know they're going to be my favorites. But for this one, I was surprised at how low it's going to be, but that's the way it's got to be. And number 25, Everything's Eventual. And for the last spot in this episode, number 24, this might piss some Dark Tower fans off, because I know a lot of Dark Tower fans do enjoy this novella, but there are quite a few Dark Tower fans that have probably never read this, so you guys might be curious about this. And that'll be The Little Sisters of Illyria. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what this novella is about, The Little Sisters of Illyria is basically a prequel novel for the Dark Tower series. It takes place before the Gunslinger, but it also takes place after the events of Wizard and Glass. Since Wizard and Glass is more of like a flashback tale of Roland's past, it takes place in between, chronologically, books 4 and book 1, which is a confusing mess, but that's the best way I can explain it. And again, just because it's number 24 does not mean that it's a bad novella. It's a good novella. Just for me, you know, being a really big Dark Tower fan, it's probably my least favorite Dark Tower story. Like, even something like Wind Through the Keyhole, I think I enjoy more. Even Wolves of the Kala, which I've said before is my least favorite Dark Tower novel. I do prefer that. And for this one, it's definitely more of like a self-contained story, and it's a novella, and it's only like 85 pages. And another thing about it is, like, since it's a prequel, like, there's not a lot of stakes involved, because like you're following Roland the Gunslinger before the events of book 1, so you know, like, he's not in danger. And that's kind of like my thing with prequels. It's like, sure, they can be fun, and it can be fun to get back into the minds of the characters that we love, but at the same time, the stakes are just so much lower, and for me, it's just not as gratifying a read. The same thing happened to me with the Witcher series. I love the Witcher series, and then he came out with Season of Storms, which takes place before a lot of that series, so I'm reading it, and I'm like, well, it's fun, but like, there's no stakes, because we all know that Geralt's gonna live, and he'll be fine. So kind of the same thing with this deal. It's entertaining enough for it to be pretty good, but also it's not like on the edge of your seat level, like, oh my god, what's gonna happen, because he's gonna live. Like, spoiler alert. But yeah, it's pretty good, but at the same time, there's definitely more novellas that I'm interested in and that I think are better. But definitely, if you're a Dark Tower fan and you love the Dark Tower series and you haven't read this, or even if you haven't heard of it, please go check out The Little Sisters of Illyria and see what you think, because you might love it. A lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but I have heard people say that it's their favorite Dark Tower story, which kind of baffles me, but, you know, it does have its fans, so I know some people do really love it. For me, I think it's pretty good, but definitely, like, in terms of like Dark Tower material, it's probably my least favorite Dark Tower story. So because of that, I'm going to put The Little Sisters of Illyria at number 24. All right, so this concludes episode 3 of my Stephen King ranking novella series, the Eventual episode, because all 3 of the novellas in this episode were included in the collection Everything's Eventual. And just as a quick recap, number 26, 1408, wasn't as good as I remember it being. It's still worth reading, but especially like if you've never read it before, I highly recommend it. But for me, the second time reading it didn't quite hit as home as well. And then number 25, kind of the same deal, Everything's Eventual. Wasn't quite as good the second time, but it does have a Dark Tower connection, and the ending is very good. And then speaking of Dark Tower, number 24, Little Sisters of Illyria, sort of a prequel novella that, again, it takes place before the Gunslinger, but after Wizard and Glass, the flashbacks. It's so weird, guys. But, you know, the Dark Tower is weird, so what do you expect? And then look for episode 4, 2 weeks from when this episode will be uploaded. That'll be sort of the last episode of my first tier of novellas, which I'm calling the Decent Novellas. And for that episode, at least 2 of the novellas are way higher on the list than I ever expected them to be. I reread them, and I do have some issues with them, but they were way better than I remembered them being. I remember the first time reading them, and I wasn't a huge fan of them, but reading them this time around, I did enjoy them quite a bit more. And then I'm still kind of on the fence what I want to do with number 21. I'm going to have to reread a couple of novellas again and just kind of like, be more precise with the list. I'm going to try to narrow it down. I'm pretty sure I know what I'm going to go with, but, I've got some time to decide. And I love how I decided to do it bi-weekly, so I'm not like rushing to finish all of these novellas. So again, look for episode 4, 2 weeks from when this episode is uploaded. And next Friday, I'm going to be releasing a brand new tag video, the Dark Tower book tag. It's going to be similar to my Stephen King book tag, but in this one, all of the questions are of course going to be related to the Dark Tower in some way, in some fashion, and it'll be a lot of fun doing that and hopefully spreading that out to the constant readers and the Dark Tower fans of BookTube. I think that'll be a lot of fun. But anyway, let me know what you guys thought of my ranking for these novellas and for the previous episodes. Have I mentioned so far any of your all-time favorite or your all-time least favorite Stephen King novellas? Please let me know down in the comments below. And just a friendly reminder that on Monday, November the 1st, I will officially be launching my Stephen King short story book club right on my Bookish Drummer Discord. And we will be reading Night Shift, which is his first short story collection, and we're going to be going through 1 short story a week, sometimes 2 if they're short enough, and we're just going to basically chat about them as we go along. And I'm going to, every time we, read a short story, every week I'm going to open up a new channel for discussion, and we're just going to have a lot of fun discussing some classic Stephen King short stories. And of course, I'll leave a link down below for the Bookish Drummer Discord in case anyone hasn't signed up yet, or if you're just now learning about it. If you're interested, please come join us, and we're just going to be reading some good classic Stephen King short stories and having a blast talking about them. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. Thank you so much for watching, and have a terrific day.